Hey y'all, my name is Priscilla and welcome back to my channel. For today's video, I'm going to be wrapping up the books that I read for the Book Read Harder Challenge year 2019. So I'm going to try to keep this rapid fire style and not going into too much detail about these books, because the Book Read Harder Challenge, if you don't know, is an annual challenge that has 24 prompts and that encourages you to read a little bit more widely, maybe outside of your comfort zone. And that's why I like doing it. I did very well this year, so we need to go ahead and talk about these books quickly, so that way this video isn't long for me to edit and long for you to watch. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first challenge is to read an epistolary novel or a collection of letters. I completed this by reading 84 Charing Cross Road by Helen Hoff. I have an unpopular opinion because I did not like this book. This is a story about a New York author, a writer, that is seeking out to all of these books from a London bookseller. And while most people say that this is a story that is very charming, a friendship that has developed over decades, I found it to be very forced and not charming at all. I thought that Helen Hoff was very pretentious and rude, so didn't get along with this book. Prompt number 2 was to read an alternate history book. And I completed this by reading the first story, River of Teeth by Sarah Gailey in the American Hippo series. This is one of those booktube darlings that I was introduced to very early on in my booktube career. And it's the story of a version of US history wherein the Louisiana swamps are overrode by hippos that were imported. So now all these Western cowboys ride them like hippos, but kind of like horses. And while I enjoyed how fun this novella was, how diverse the cast is, there's a non-binary person that uses they, them pronouns, there's a lot of people of color, there's a lot of queer relationships explored. I felt like the novella length didn't really lend enough for this story that had so much going on, but Westerns just really aren't my thing, and I think I'm learning that more and more. So prompt number 3 was to read a book by a woman and or author of color that won a literary award in year 2018. So now we're on one of my favorites of this list that I actually read because I finally picked up N.K. Jemisin by reading the 5th season. This is a Hugo Award-winning series that focuses on Black folks, on power dynamics, and on oppression, along with this backdrop of the apocalypse, and also with our main character that is experiencing the apocalypse of herself. So it's super fascinating, so much to unpack in this story. I'm very much looking forward to reading more from N.K. Jemisin. Prompt number 4 was to read a humor book, and I read So Close to Being the Shit Y'all Don't Even Know by Baretta. This is a book that I didn't really know about until I went looking for humor books. And I am aware of Baretta because she had a breakout role on Parks and Recreation. And this is the story about a celebrity's rag to riches story, how she broke into the industry and how she found success and has success as an actor now. And I thought that her narration of the audiobook was really fun, and I enjoyed listening to her talk, honestly. But this is one of those humor books that can be forgettable, especially if you aren't connected at all or don't really know much about the person you're reading about to begin with. Prompt number 5 was to read a book by a journalist or about journalism. So I completed this prompt by reading Stranger, The Challenge of a Latino Immigrant in the Trump Era by Jorge Ramos. So Stranger is a nonfiction collection of essays written by Ramos that are sort of memoir-esque about his upbringing in Mexico City, about his entrance into journalism, but also a critique on Trump's and even Obama's immigration policies. This is the sort of book that I think is very current, almost so current that it could be irrelevant in a few years. But I really did enjoy how data-driven it was, how it debunks all these myths about immigration, and how Ramos gives this advice to other children of immigrants, and how he describes what it's like as a Latinx immigrant in the United States right now. So really glad that I read this. So prompt number 6 was to read a book by an author of color set in or about space. You know that I did this because this year I read and adored the Xenogenesis series by Octavia Butler. This is the story about a Black woman named Lilith that is abducted by aliens, and how they commingle and coexist, and how the future is completely changed based on these aliens' envision of what a future existence looks like. That's kind of the non-spoilery way to talk about this, but it's so good. I did a full series review of this book if you'd like to know more about it, but so good. But prepare yourself if you plan on picking this up. There's lots of trigger warnings, and I read this in a frenzy. You probably will too if you decide to read it. Prompt number 7 was to read an Own Voices book set in Mexico or in Central America. And I definitely completed this task by reading Gods of Jade and Shadow by Sylvia Mariana Garcia. Sylvia Mariana Garcia is, I think, solidified as one of my favorite authors now, and this book is no exception. It is amazing, and I'm so glad that I read it for this prompt. This was one of my most anticipated reads last year. It's about Cassiopeia, our main character, and her relationship and journey with a Mayan god of death named Huncame through Mexico, through the Mayan underworld, to help him regain his power. And it's so good. You should read this if you didn't get to it in the year 2019. Prompt number 8 was to read an Own Voices book set in Oceania. Okay, so this is my first prompt that I failed because I DNF'd on The Sunday She Created God by Jerry Politis, I think is how you pronounce that name. This is an Australian story written by an Australian author of color. And Jaclyn over at 6 Minutes For Me, who reads a lot of Aussie Lit, recommended this book. And that's why I picked it up. It's super short and very stream of consciousness, but almost too much in a way because I couldn't get along with the writing. I couldn't grasp the plot, any plot. There is no plot. And I think that's why I ended up DNFing it. This is a case of picking it up at the wrong time because I was not in the mood for that. So I do need to read books that are set in Oceania because this is a part of the world that I neglect a lot. So I will be looking forward to all of Jaclyn's recs because she is a great booktuber that speaks a lot and recommends a lot of Australian books. Especially with the burning that's going on there, I feel like it's important to open and widen my reading tastes by reading some books from people from there. So that's why I like this challenge. It's challenging, but it definitely opens my eyes to a couple of blind spots that I have in reading. So the next prompt is to read a book published prior to January 1st, 2019 with fewer than 100 reviews on Goodreads. I ended up reading The Pulse Between Dimensions and the Desert by Ariel Stella. It's a collection of short stories written by a queer Latinx author that I enjoyed her debut, so I wanted to understand a bit more about her writing style. I think I accomplished that by reading her book, her short stories, because I have a grasp and understanding of her abstract, bizarre take on horror and speculative fiction. And I like how she talks about sexuality and being Latinx. That Latinx identity discussion is always there and great. But I feel like these short stories were all incomplete and underdeveloped. So I ended up not really liking this, but I'm still glad that I read them because I understand her perspective in her writing so much more. So still looking forward to whatever she writes next. Prompt number 10 was to read a translated book written by and or translated by a woman. I completed this prompt by reading Sonis Elena, finally, it's been on my shelf for a long time, by Mayra Santos Febres. Now this is a book that I was interested in reading because Febres is a Afro-Latinx author from Puerto Rico, and I have heard a lot of good things. Firstly, this is a story about a 15-year-old homeless person that is saved from the streets by a drag queen, and it's all about gender and sexuality and poverty and the Puerto Rican culture and identity, and all those things sound like things I would enjoy. But I think that because this story is told in a non-linear format, because it's translated, maybe because there's a lot of POVs that all sound the same, I couldn't differentiate any of the voices. I felt like this book just didn't work for me. Prompt number 11 was to read a book of manga, and I read Saturn Apartments, and I'll put the author's name on the screen because I didn't look up how to pronounce this. So this is one of the first mangas that I've ever read. The only other manga I've read is My Brother's Husband, but Saturn Apartments is a slice of life science fiction about a main character who works on a space station, lives and works on a space station, and works as a window cleaner. And it's really just about his day-to-day life, not really knowing where his life is going, not understanding why his father disappeared, who was also a window cleaner, the mystery surrounding that. And while I enjoyed the art, I enjoyed some of the cute moments here and there, I found that this was more of a lackluster read because of the lack of plot, because I didn't really see the point. After I read it, I was like, what did I just read? What was the point of reading that? Prompt number 12 was to read a book in which an animal or an inanimate object is a point of view character. So I may be stretching this prompt a little bit with the book that I chose to fulfill this prompt, but I loved it anyway, so I'm gonna talk about it because I really loved Dragon Pearl by Yoon Ha Lee. This is a middle grade installment in the Rick Riordan Presents imprint about Korean mythology, and our main character Min is a 12-year-old that has fox magic, and I think she talks about being a fox. So that's an animal, that's a point POV character, and this is one of those books that solidified why I love middle grade and why I've been getting along with middle grade so great this year, and will probably continue to read middle grade forever. This is a story about grief and about sibling relationships and adventure on other planets and spaceships with space pirates and creatures and dragons and spirits, and it's fun but also hard hitting on its themes and topics, and that's my jam. That is a perfect mix for a book for me. Prompt number 3 was to read a book by or about someone that identifies as neurodiverse. This is another prompt that I will be stretching a bit. So I read My Life as an Ice Cream Sandwich by Ibiza Boy. This is a middle grade that features a main character who, although doesn't explicitly identify as neurodiverse, I read as having maybe autism or having being on the spectrum. And Ibiza Boy actually tweeted that the main character is differently brained. So I feel like that's coded for neurodiversity, and I'm going to count it for this prompt. This is a story taking place in the 1980s following Ebony, who is a Black girl living with her father and is different, is unique, and who has created this fantasy world, has this great grand imagination, and that uses this as a lens for reality and doesn't fit in, but doesn't necessarily change who she is to fit in. And I think that's a really great message. I had a lot of fun reading this book. It's some of the most whimsical writing that I read all year, and I'm glad that I read it for this prompt. Prompt number 14 was to read a cozy mystery, and I completed this by reading Death by Dumpling by Vivian Chen. This is the first in her Noodle Shop mystery series, and I had a whole hell of a lot of fun reading this series. Its own voices for the Chinese American representation, and it follows a woman named Lana who works in her family's noodle shop and that work within the greater Asia Village community in her Ohio home, and someone dies from eating one of their dumplings and she's gonna find out how. I felt like this book was just balanced really well with its humor, with the whodunit mystery elements, as well as including a lot of commentary on Chinese culture and identity and how Lana really doesn't know where she's going with life and having to deal with all these things at the same time. So I thoroughly enjoyed it and will probably continue reading this series. Prompt number 15 was to read a book of mythology or folklore. And this is another bummer because I read A Storm Runner by J.C. Cervantes. This is another imprint of the Rick Riordan Presents, and it's middle grade, and I hate talking about it because it makes me angry thinking about it. It was one of my most disappointing reads of 2019, to be honest. It was pitched as a story, an adventure about Mayan folklore, about this boy who is undoubtedly going to be tied to these gods somehow, and he's disabled. And what I hated most about this was the internalized ableism that Zane feels about himself, and that isn't ever explored enough in a way where his acceptance of himself isn't coded or just a front for his ableism. Like, it just makes me so mad that some of the core elements of this plot were tied to why he is disabled, as if he is broken and imperfect. I just didn't like the ableism in this book. Let's just leave it at that. And I'm super disappointed and probably won't be continue on with this series at all. Okay, switching gears, let's talk about some things I liked. The next prompt was to read an historical romance written by an author of color. I actually read a few of these, but the first one that I read was The Infamous Miss Rodriguez by Lydia San Andres. This is Own Voices Latinx romance that is written by a woman in the Caribbean about an Afro-Latinx heroine and a Latinx hero. In this story, the main character is trying to cause a scandal, and her aunt has hired a man to clear up all her scandals and keep her out of the public eye. And of course, they fall in love. There's a marriage of convenience trope in this. The male hero is poor. The female is a woman of society. She's a socialite. So there was an interesting discussion on classism and poverty and the privilege that some people have over others. So I enjoyed that. I liked the setting in the Spanish Caribbean in the early 1900s, and it was just fun, and I'm glad that I read it. I will definitely be reading more from Lydia San Andres. The next prompt was to read a business book, and I read Reset by Ellen Pyle. This is a book that I picked up because I remember that she was interviewed on The Daily Show, and she spoke about, she's of Chinese descent, and how she worked in the tech industry and how she sued her venture capitalist company, her ex-company, Kleiner Perkins, for discrimination. And her memoir is all about inclusivity of women and people of color in the tech industry in corporate settings. And it has a lot of practical advice, but also is very vulnerable and personal to her story and the specific case that happened and the public case that happened with Kleiner Perkins. And I really enjoyed it. I did a full vlog talking about my reading experience as I was reading this book, so definitely check that out if you're interested. So prompt number 18 was to read a novel by a trans or non-binary author. So I read Freshwater by Akwaeke Emeze this year, and I don't think that they necessarily identify as trans, but they use they, them pronouns, so I'm going to be including them as an author that's on the spectrum. Freshwater is going to be one of my favorite books of the year, spoiler, but it was such a spiritual, blasphemous sort of book, unlike anything I've ever read. It is also partly autobiographical, as it details their experience of having other gods within them, of being an Ovanje. And oh, it's so good. It's so triggering as well, so take care if you want to read this, but highly recommend Akwaeke Emeze. I am going to read everything that they write. Book number 19 was to read a book of non-violent true crime. Okay, so this is my second DNF from this list. I attempted to read The Dinosaur Artist by Paige Williams, and I lost my interest in this book very early on. This is a nonfiction book about it was a Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton that was stolen from Mongolia and that was sold on the black market in New York City at this auction, and that got a lot of attention because where the hell did this T-Rex come from? The book started to focus on curators. It was really interesting talking about skeletons and collections and collectors and curators that work for museums and science, but then it started to get into like the nitty gritty of these curators and scientists' personal lives. And I'm like, I don't care. So I lost interest like very quickly and DNF'd it. So prompt number 20 was to read a book written in prison. And I read De Profundis by Oscar Wilde. De Profundis is at its core a love letter from Oscar Wilde to Alfred Douglas. And in a way, I think also to himself. It's very spiritual and very melancholy. And it talks about sadness, and while it is very well written, I thought it wasn't cohesive at all and just not really something that I will remember a few months later after having read it. So it was good. I can respect its technical writing, but kind of forgettable. Prompt number 20 was to read a comic by an LGBTQIA creator. So I read World of Akanda, which is written by Ta-Nehisi Coates and Roxane Gay. Roxane Gay is one of my favorite authors, in case you didn't know. I've read most of her works. I think the only thing that I haven't read by her is Aiti, which is her short story collection. But that's why I picked this up. I thought that this comic was good. The art was nice. It focuses on the relationship between two of the Black Panther, what is they called? And I love that. I'm here for that. I'm here for queer relationships, here for sapphic relationships, but I don't know. Marvel DC, those kinds of series are hard for you to just jump into. I feel like I'm missing something because I don't have much of that context. I probably won't be continuing on. It was okay, but I feel like I was just missing something, even having read the full volume. Prompt number 22 was to read a children's or middle grade book, not YA, that has won a diversity award since the year 2009. I was gonna say 2019. And yep, I sure did that. If you didn't know, I'm loving picture books as well since reading so many last year. But I read Dreamers by Yuyi Morales, but this is Own Voices, a Latinx. I think the main character and the author are both Mexican, and it has won a Buda Belpre award. So I love this picture book. I didn't actually own it, but I got it for Christmas. And I'm so glad that I did, because this is a gorgeous story about a woman and her child that are traveling from Mexico and moving to the United States, and how they find a love of literature and public libraries. And that's just everything that I love about wholesome, warm children's picture books. And I highly recommend you read it. Prompt number 23 was to read a self-published book. So I took this opportunity to read some more romance, and I read the first in the Hoops series called Long Shot by Kennedy Ryan. Kennedy Ryan is a Black author. She was one of the first Black authors to win a Rita Award, which I don't want to get into the RWA scandal that is happening right now, but that's what made me want to read this book. I knew going into this that this book was heavily focused on domestic abuse. It's a very long book, and I think it needed to be that long to really explore and handle such a heavy topic and still give our heroine, our main character, her happy ending. So yeah, this book is so hard to read at times, but it is so worth it to work through. I just loved it so much. Highly recommend it. The last prompt is to read a collection of poetry published since 2014. So I read Life on Mars by Tracy K. Smith. I know this book won a lot of awards. The author is Black. She was the poet laureate for the United States, and that's why I wanted to read her work. I actually read one of these poems in a full dedicated video if you'd like to learn more about it. There's definitely like a sense of wonder in all of her poems, and that's something that I really enjoy, but there's others that are so focused on something that it's hard for me to really get into her writing style, especially if she writes about things like David Bowie or other things that I don't have the context for. So I think her poems are more of a hit or miss for me. So that was my Read Harder Challenge wrap-up video. I will be doing a TBR for the 2020 challenge, so make sure to look out for that. If you saw anything in this video that maybe you want to know more about me or my reading tastes, I have a video for that. I'm doing a Q&A for reaching 1,000 subscribers, so I will leave that linked in the cards and below. I'll leave it linked everywhere for you to check out, for you to leave all your questions. So make sure to check that out. But that's all I have for this video today. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next one. Bye.